How do you emotionally distance yourself from someone you love when their inability to connect emotionally is slowly destroying you? Avoidance can go silent for days without explanation, treat your need for connection like a personal attack, and make you feel clingy for wanting basic emotional intimacy. They have a way of making you feel like you're asking for the impossible when you're asking for normal human connection. They'll give you just enough to keep you hoping, then pull back the moment you start to feel secure. If you're here, you've probably already tried everything else. You've been patient, you've been understanding, you've accommodated their need for space, respected their boundaries, and loved them exactly as they are. But somewhere along the way, you realize that all your accommodating hasn't created the relationship you actually need to be happy. Detaching from an avoidant partner isn't easy, but it's something you can learn to do because you're not detaching from someone who treated you badly or obviously wrong. You're detaching from someone whose natural way of being is fundamentally incompatible with your emotional needs, despite both of you being decent people trying your best. This creates a specific type of grief that most people don't understand. You're mourning the loss of potential, the death of hope, and the end of a connection with someone you genuinely care about. You're also mourning your own naive belief that love would be enough to bridge differences that turned out to be unbridgeable. Understanding why detachment is necessary doesn't make it easier, but it does make it clearer. When you've spent months or years trying to create emotional intimacy with someone whose nervous system interprets your need for connection as a threat, you eventually reach a breaking point where protecting yourself becomes more important than protecting the relationship. The process of detaching from an avoidant isn't linear, and it's not something you do once and then you're done. It's more like learning a new way of being in relationship with someone, a way that prioritizes your emotional safety over their comfort, your needs over their limitations, and your long-term well-being over short-term harmony. Let me walk you through what this actually looks like in practice, because most advice about detachment is either too vague to be useful or too harsh to be sustainable when you're dealing with someone you still care about. The first step in healthy detachment is accepting that you cannot change their attachment style, their emotional capacity, or their willingness to meet you halfway. This sounds simple, but it's actually one of the hardest things you'll ever do because it requires giving up the hope that's been keeping you invested in the relationship. Most people who love avoidance spend enormous amounts of energy trying to prove that they're safe, that they won't leave, that they understand and accept the avoidance limitations. But all this effort is based on the assumption that if you just find the right approach, the avoidant will eventually feel safe enough to love you the way you need to be loved. Detachment begins with recognizing that this assumption is false. Their emotional limitations aren't about you, and they can't be solved by you. You could be the most patient, understanding, accommodating partner in the world, and it still wouldn't change the fundamental fact that their nervous system experiences emotional intimacy as a threat. This realization feels devastating at first because it means acknowledging that all your efforts have been directed at an impossible goal. You've been trying to create safety for someone whose definition of safety is fundamentally different from yours. You've been speaking a language they can't understand while trying to learn a language they can't teach. Once you accept that you can't change them, you can redirect all that energy you've been spending on managing their emotions into taking care of your own needs. This is where the real work of detachment begins. The second step is learning to stop taking their emotional unavailability personally. This is crucial because one of the most damaging aspects of loving an avoidant is how it erodes your sense of self-worth over time. When someone consistently struggles to meet your basic emotional needs, it's natural to start wondering if you're asking for too much, if you're too needy, if you're the problem in the relationship. Avoidants often reinforce these doubts, not out of malice, but because it's easier for them to frame your needs as excessive than to acknowledge their own limitations. Detachment requires recognizing that their inability to provide emotional intimacy says nothing about your worth as a person or the validity of your needs. You're not too much. You're not asking for too much. You're asking for normal human connection from someone whose nervous system can't provide it consistently. Understanding this intellectually is different from feeling it emotionally, which is why detachment takes time. You have to rebuild your sense of what's normal and reasonable in relationships after months or years of adapting to someone else's limitations. Part of this process involves reconnecting with friends, family members, or other relationships where emotional intimacy feels natural and reciprocal. When you've been in a relationship with an avoidant for a long time, you can forget what it feels like to have someone genuinely interested in your thoughts and feelings, someone who doesn't make you feel like you're asking for too much when you want to connect. These other relationships serve as reality checks, reminding you that the emotional starvation you've been experiencing isn't normal or sustainable. They help you remember that you're capable of easy, natural connection with people whose emotional systems are compatible with yours. The third step involves creating practical and emotional boundaries that protect your well-being even if you choose to stay in the relationship. This is where many people get confused because they think detachment means ending the relationship, but that's not always necessary or desired. Sometimes detachment means staying in the relationship, but changing your expectations and energy investment to match what the other person can actually provide. Instead of hoping they'll eventually meet your emotional needs, you find ways to meet those needs elsewhere while accepting the relationship for what it actually is, rather than what it could potentially become. This might mean stopping the emotional labor you've been doing to try to make them more comfortable with intimacy. No more walking on eggshells to avoid triggering their withdrawal. No more managing your own natural responses to make space for their limitations. No more shrinking yourself to fit into the small emotional space they're offering. Practical detachment looks like this. When they go silent, you don't chase them with texts or calls trying to figure out what went wrong. When they pull back after a moment of closeness, you don't analyze what you did to cause it. When they make you feel like you're asking for too much, you remind yourself that wanting emotional connection is normal and healthy. You stop being available whenever they decide they want attention, and you start prioritizing your own emotional needs over their comfort with distance. This doesn't mean punishing them or playing games. It means treating yourself with the same consideration you've been giving them. The fourth step is learning to redirect the energy you've been putting into trying to connect with them. When you love an avoidant, you develop habits of emotional pursuit that become automatic. You check your phone constantly hoping for their messages. You analyze their moods trying to figure out how to get closer. You modify your behavior based on their emotional temperature. All of this energy needs somewhere else to go. The most effective way to detach is to become genuinely invested in parts of your life that have nothing to do with them. This isn't about making them jealous or proving you don't need them. It's about remembering who you are outside of your attempts to connect with someone who can't meet you halfway. Start saying yes to social invitations you've been declining because you were hoping to spend time with them. Reconnect with hobbies and interests that got pushed aside while you were focused on managing the relationship. Invest time in friendships that actually reciprocate your energy instead of constantly trying to earn scraps of attention from someone who treats connection like a threat. This redirection serves two purposes. First, it gives you perspective on how much of your life and energy you've been organizing around someone else's emotional limitations. Second, it reminds you that you're capable of easy, fulfilling connections with people whose emotional systems are compatible with yours. The fifth step involves learning to sit with the discomfort of not knowing where you stand with them without trying to fix it through pursuit or accommodation. Avoidants create uncertainty as a way of maintaining emotional distance, and your natural response has probably been to try to create security through your own efforts. But detachment requires accepting that you can't create security with someone whose nervous system experiences your security seeking as pressure. The more you try to nail down where you stand, the more elusive they become. The more you try to prove you're safe, the more threatened they feel. Learning to be comfortable with uncertainty in the relationship doesn't mean you have to accept it forever. It means you stop letting their inability to provide clarity control your emotional state. You develop your own sense of stability that doesn't depend on their reassurance or commitment. This is perhaps the hardest part of detachment because it goes against every instinct you have about how relationships should work. Most healthy relationships involve both people working to create mutual security and understanding. With avoidance, your efforts to create security often push them further away. creating a cycle where your natural relationship instincts make the problem worse. Breaking this cycle requires learning to find emotional security within yourself and in other relationships, while accepting that this particular person may never be able to provide the kind of consistent emotional connection you need. The sixth step is recognizing and changing the stories you tell yourself about why you're staying in a relationship that consistently leaves you feeling emotionally starved. Most people who struggle to detach from avoidance have created elaborate justifications for why they should keep trying. You might tell yourself that they just need more time, that they're worth the wait, that you can see their potential underneath their emotional walls. You might believe that your love will eventually heal their attachment wounds, or that you're the first person who really understands them. These stories keep you invested in a dynamic that's hurting you because they frame your suffering as noble, your patience as virtue, and your emotional starvation as temporary rather than structural. Detachment requires honest acknowledgement that these stories are protecting you from facing a painful truth. This person may never be able to love you the way you need to be loved, no matter how much you love them or how long you wait. This doesn't make them a bad person or mean your connection isn't real. It just means that love isn't always enough to bridge fundamental incompatibilities in emotional needs and capacities. Changing these stories feels like betraying the relationship, but it's actually the first step toward making decisions based on reality rather than hope. When you can see the situation clearly without the protective stories, you can choose whether to stay based on what the relationship actually offers rather than what you hope it might become. The seventh step involves developing what I call emotional immunity to their inconsistent behavior. After months or years with an avoidant, you've probably developed heightened sensitivity to their moods, their availability, and their subtle signals about emotional distance or closeness. You've learned to read between the lines of their minimal communication, to celebrate tiny moments of emotional connection, and to brace yourself for their inevitable withdrawal after closeness. Your nervous system has adapted to their patterns in ways that keep you constantly alert to their emotional state. Detachment requires gradually becoming less reactive to these patterns. When they're warm and available, you appreciate it without building expectations around it. When they withdraw, you notice it without taking it personally or trying to fix it. When they send mixed signals, you observe them without trying to decode hidden meanings. This emotional immunity develops slowly and requires consistent practice. Each time you choose not to chase them when they pull back, you're building evidence that you can be okay regardless of their behavior. Each time you don't drop everything when they suddenly want attention, you're proving to yourself that your life has value independent of their availability. The goal isn't to stop caring about them, it's to stop letting their emotional inconsistency determine your emotional state. You can care about someone while maintaining protective distance from their inability to provide consistent emotional connection. Most people think detachment means becoming cold or indifferent, but healthy detachment actually allows you to love more freely because you're not constantly trying to protect yourself from disappointment or manage their comfort with distance. The eighth step is learning to trust your own emotional responses instead of constantly questioning whether you're being too sensitive, too needy, or too demanding. One of the most damaging effects of trying to love an avoidant is how it teaches you to doubt your own emotional instincts. When someone consistently treats your normal needs for connection as excessive, you start to internalize their perspective. You begin to wonder if you really are too much, if your expectations are unreasonable, if you should be able to feel satisfied with the minimal emotional connection they're offering. Detachment requires reconnecting with your own emotional wisdom and trusting that your needs for reciprocal connection, emotional intimacy, and consistent communication are reasonable and healthy. Your feelings of loneliness, frustration, and confusion in the relationship are information, not character flaws. Start paying attention to how you feel in other relationships compared to how you feel with the avoidant. Notice the difference between friendships where emotional connection flows naturally and this relationship where every interaction feels carefully managed to avoid triggering their discomfort. This comparison isn't about judging the avoidant as wrong or broken. It's about recognizing that your emotional responses are calibrated to healthy relationship dynamics, and your discomfort in this relationship is evidence that something important is missing, not evidence that you're too demanding. Trusting your emotional responses means validating your own experience instead of constantly trying to see things from their perspective at the expense of your own emotional reality. The ninth step involves creating a support system of people who understand what you're going through and can remind you of your worth when the avoidance behavior makes you forget it. Isolation is one of the biggest obstacles to healthy detachment because it leaves you alone with your doubts and their version of reality. Find people who can validate your experience without trying to fix the relationship for you. You need friends who will remind you that wanting emotional intimacy is normal, that feeling frustrated with inconsistent communication is reasonable, and that you deserve to be with someone who doesn't make you feel like a burden for having feelings. This support system serves as a reality check when you start doubting yourself or making excuses for treatment that leaves you feeling emotionally starved. Sometimes you need other people to reflect back to you what you can't see clearly when you're inside the dynamic. Support can come from friends who've been through similar situations, online communities for people dealing with avoidant partners, therapy, or support groups focused on attachment and relationship patterns. The key is finding people who understand the specific challenges of loving someone who can't reciprocate emotional intimacy consistently. These connections also remind you that you're capable of easy, natural emotional connection with people whose attachment systems work differently. When you've been trying to create intimacy with someone who treats it as a threat, you can forget that emotional connection doesn't have to be this difficult. The 10th step is learning to make decisions based on your actual experience rather than hope for future change. Avoidants are particularly good at giving just enough intermittent reinforcement to keep hope alive without providing consistent emotional connection. They'll have moments of openness that remind you why you fell for them in the first place, followed by periods of distance that leave you wondering what changed. These cycles create what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, which is actually more addictive than consistent positive reinforcement. Detachment requires learning to base your decisions on patterns rather than exceptions. Instead of focusing on their good moments and hoping those represent who they really are, look at the overall pattern of emotional availability and connection in the relationship. Ask yourself, over the past 6 months, how often have you felt truly emotionally connected to this person? How often have you felt secure about where you stand with them? How often have they initiated emotional intimacy versus how often you've had to request it or create it yourself? These pattern-based assessments give you clearer information for decision-making than focusing on peak moments of connection or hope for future improvement. They help you see whether the relationship is actually meeting your needs or just providing enough intermittent reinforcement to keep you hoping it eventually will. Making decisions based on patterns rather than potential is one of the most difficult but important aspects of healthy detachment. It requires accepting present reality instead of betting on future transformation. The final step in detaching from an avoidant involves accepting that you may need to love them from a distance if their emotional capacity doesn't align with your relationship needs. This doesn't necessarily mean ending all contact, but it does mean adjusting your expectations and energy investment to match what they can actually provide. Sometimes loving someone means accepting that you can't be together in the way you both might want. If your attachment systems are fundamentally incompatible, you can care about someone deeply while recognizing that trying to force connection with them hurts both of you. This kind of loving detachment allows you to appreciate what they can offer without constantly feeling frustrated by what they can't. It creates space for them to be themselves without pressure to be different, while protecting you from the constant disappointment of unmet emotional needs. Some people find that creating this emotional distance actually improves their relationship with the avoidant because it removes the pressure and pursuit that triggers their withdrawal. Others discover that without the hope for deeper connection, the relationship doesn't provide enough fulfillment to continue. Both outcomes are valid. The goal of detachment isn't necessarily to save the relationship. It's to create enough emotional clarity to make decisions based on what actually serves your well-being, rather than what you hope might eventually happen. Something important to understand about this process is that detachment isn't linear. You'll have good days where you feel strong and clear about your boundaries, and difficult days where you want to fall back into old patterns of pursuing and accommodating. This is normal and doesn't mean you're failing at detachment. Each time you choose yourself over their comfort, each time you don't chase when they withdraw, each time you trust your own emotional responses instead of their version of reality, you're building emotional strength that compounds over time. The goal isn't perfection, it's progress toward a healthier relationship with both yourself and them, whether that relationship continues in its current form or evolves into something different. Detaching from an avoidant partner is ultimately about reclaiming your emotional autonomy and making relationship choices based on reality rather than potential. It's about loving yourself enough to stop accepting emotional breadcrumbs while hoping for a full meal. The process requires patience with yourself as you unlearn patterns of pursuit and accommodation that probably felt like love, but were actually attempts to manage someone else's emotional limitations. It takes time to rebuild trust in your own emotional instincts and to remember that your needs for connection and intimacy are reasonable and important. Remember that you can't love someone into emotional availability, and trying to do so usually results in you losing touch with your own emotional needs. Healthy detachment protects your capacity to love by ensuring you don't exhaust yourself trying to create connection with someone whose nervous system can't reciprocate consistently. Whether you choose to stay in the relationship with new boundaries or decide to love them from a distance, detachment gives you the emotional clarity to make choices that serve your authentic well-being rather than your hope for what might someday be possible. Have you tried to detach from an avoidant partner before? Share in the comments what worked for you and what didn't. If this helped you understand the detachment process, like this video and subscribe for more insights about protecting your emotional well-being in challenging relationship dynamics. Thanks for watching.